Hey guys, and welcome to video number 1 for chapter 27. Chapter 27 is on tradition and change in East Asia. So they go, well, what does that mean? Well, we're going to be talking about a couple things. We'll be talking about the restoration of Chinese power in China, a slight shift in terms of ethnic control in China with the Qing Dynasty, and then we'll be looking at some significant kind of progressions and changes that happen a couple of miles across the sea in Japan as well. For this first video, though, we're going to be looking at Chinese restoration. You know, the Yuan dynasty with the Mongols collapsed in 1368, and the Mongols were driven back into the north from China. And the Chinese immediately sought to restore Chinese traditions such as merit-based bureaucracy and Confucianism. And the first dynasty to assert control after the Mongols was the Ming Dynasty. Now, as I said, Ming rulers immediately set about bringing back traditional Chinese government, first and foremost by strengthening the government. Emperors such as Hongwu and Yongle, they implemented policies that strengthened imperial control. At the same time, Ming rulers worked to ensure that conquest by foreigners like the Mongols wouldn't happen again. They built up the military, both navy and army, and they moved the capital to Beijing in order to keep a closer watch on the Mongols. You know, prior to this, the capital was farther in the south in Nanjing. You know, still to this day, a very important Chinese city, but the current capital is much farther north with Beijing, and the Ming Dynasty was the first one to move it up there. Additionally, to protect themselves from the north, they added to the Great Wall. Now, the Great Wall goes back a long time. The original parts were built back in the 3rd century BCE by the Qing Dynasty. But that had fallen into disrepair, obviously, over hundreds of years. The more modernized parts of the wall were built by the Ming Dynasty, right? So you see, even some pre-Qin walls are kind of scattered throughout. But the Qin Great Wall, these blue sections in here, those are kind of what we first referred to as the Great Wall. But the Ming Great Wall, the black, you noticed how, even though there are some gaps to it, it still forms a little bit more of a continual line separating the north from the south. Okay, so, you know, our more iconic imagery of China from the Great Wall, such as you see there, that's all from the Ming Dynasty. You know, you're not going to be able to walk around on the wall that goes back to the, BCE era. All right, other things that they did, restore Chinese culture. You know, they sought to erase all Mongol influence from China. They brought back the civil service exams, made Confucianism a priority again. And like early dynasties, unfortunately, though, they fell into problems, and that led to decline. There were external problems, like, increasingly destructive pirate raids, but what ultimately led to the dynasty's collapse was the decline in government performance. Later Ming emperors, they lived very extravagant lives. They isolated themselves in the Forbidden City. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about that later. They put authority in the hands of their personal attendants, and this led to increasing corruption and abuse of power. Famine eventually struck in the early 1600s, followed by peasant uprisings in the 1630s, and this forced the Ming rulers to seek help from people to the north, known as the Manchus. Now, this in turn led to the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was founded when the rebellion against the Ming was put down. Now, as I just said, this was largely due to the help from outsiders known as the Manchus. However, rather than restore the Ming to power, the Manchus simply moved their capital to Beijing and started their own dynasty. So first, let's talk about the people themselves, the Manchus. Manchu people are a separate ethnicity from Han Chinese and are from the region known as Manchuria. Okay, the Manchuria, kind of different regions of it, it makes up this area along the border between China, Mongolia, Russia, and Korea as well. Okay, so this whole shaded area is Manchuria. It would be a very important area in the 20th century as well, with the world wars. Okay, so they were traditionally pastoral nomads like the Mongols, but had unified in the early 1600s. All right, so here you've got your Qing homeland, and then the expansion in the little bit darker blue area to 1644. So that's really what we're going to be talking about, because you notice what's in that area by 1644. Beijing. All right, so that's when they basically take over the Chinese capital, decide this is our capital now, and now we're forming our own dynasty. By the 1630s, they had driven the Ming armies completely out of Manchuria, and they began expanding control into Mongolia and Korea. And like other northern people, they were very proficient warriors, and their takeover of Beijing in 1644, it was very different from the Mongol conquest, though. For one thing, they had the support of the Confucian scholars. The Confucian scholars hated the corruption and excesses of the Ming emperors. Manchus also, differently from the Mongols, they learned Chinese culture. Remember, the Mongols tried to completely repress it and just stick to their own culture and set themselves apart. The Manchus, they learned the Chinese language and adopted aspects of it. They adopted Confucianism. This made for a much easier transition than when the Mongols repressed Chinese culture. Now, all this being said, they still preserved their own culture. Manchus and Chinese were not allowed to marry, and some Manchu customs, like shaving the front of your head, were forced upon the Chinese. You can see how in this photograph, this style persisted even into the 20th century. All right, so, hold on, let me go back real quick and just show you the extent of the Qing expansion. It was a large empire, right? It expanded pretty much all of modern-day China. You see the Qing expansion from 1690 to 1750. Large areas even in Mongolia, through Central Asia, into the steppe, into Siberia, even into what today would be Russia. So very, very big empire. They're very good at conquering. And you notice the dates down here. They made it all the way up until 1911. So they were the last dynasty before the Chinese Republic. So, talk about Chinese government. Now, the Qing government kept much of the Ming government traditions, such as centralized government and a Confucian bureaucracy. Centralizing efforts were aided in the image of the emperor. They were aided in the image of the emperor as the son of heaven. The emperor wasn't quite a god, but he was more than a regular mortal. He was secluded from society in this region of Beijing known as the Forbidden City. You can still go and visit it today. It was just for tours and so forth. But in this Forbidden City, and it was called the Forbidden City because only people very closely associated in the emperor's inner circle were allowed in. It was not open to the public. And he was surrounded by his concubines, right, all of his girlfriends and eunuch attendants. Eunuch, Google it. You guys will see, why they use them so much. And much like Louis XIV in France, everything about the emperor was meant to awe and impress. Specific rituals like the kowtow were put into place to reinforce the emperor's status, where he had to bow very, very low in his presence. But because of his exalted status, this resulted in a degree of isolation. It also meant that emperors didn't get too involved in the running of day-to-day operations. That responsibility was for the scholar bureaucrats. Like in the Tang Song era, these mostly came from the upper class and were entirely male. Oh, got a little too ahead. I'll come back to that in a sec. Now, they had to pass very difficult exams based on Confucius's teachings, and with no public school systems, the upper class were pretty much the only ones who could get tutors. Now, this education was in preparation for the civil service exams, and there were different levels of the exams. Each one had a different difficulty. Which exam you passed determined which level employment in the government you achieved. Now, very few passed the highest level. These were grueling. They lasted for 3 days, and you had to be secluded in small prison-like cells. There were no breaks or communication between test takers. If you died taking it, which sometimes happened due to exhaustion or dehydration, your body was removed to make room for another test taker. Now, despite the craziness of how intense these exams were, a lot of young men still prepared and took them because of the high status of bureaucrats. Working for the government provided a very comfortable and influential lifestyle. Unfortunately, the heavy competition for jobs, it also led to widespread corruption and cheating. Still, it put a high emphasis on advancement through education, which was still relatively rare in the world during this time period. Plus, even though the conditions of the exams favored the wealthy, they were still technically open to everyone. It was possible, even though unlikely, for a peasant or lower class person to pass the exams and move up in life, so it represented opportunity. So that's a bit about the two dynasties and their government, and for the next one, we'll be talking about some economic and social changes.